Imagine rolling up to the starting line of the absolute biggest race of your career, and your car is completely naked. No hood, no side panels, no sleek nose cone, just a raw, skeletal steel frame holding a screaming, nitro-gulping supercharged Hemi engine. To the thousands of fans packing the stands at the 1969 NHRA US Nationals in Indianapolis, it looked like a total disaster. People walking through the pits figured the team had simply run out of cash. But here's the thing, they had not run out of money. They had run out of patience. The car was the legendary Fighting Irish Top Fuel Dragster, driven by a fearless young talent named John Mulligan and tuned by the mechanical genius Tim Beebe. Within days, that stripped-down, bare-bones machine would shatter the laws of physics and run a time that left the entire drag racing world utterly speechless. But just weeks later, the Zookeeper of drag racing would be gone. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of drag racing and the tragic, high-stakes trade-offs of early motorsport. If you're someone who loves vintage drag racing, legendary engine builders, and the untold, raw stories of automotive history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, back in the late 1960s, drag racing was transitioning from a gritty backyard hobby into a massive, highly lucrative business. Or at least, it was supposed to be a business. The National Hot Rod Association, or NHRA, had turned the US Nationals at Indy into the ultimate crown jewel of the sport. Every Labor Day, massive crowds swarmed Indianapolis Raceway Park, and national television networks like ABC were starting to bring their cameras to capture the high-octane spectacle. But here's what most people do not realize. The money flowing through the sport did not actually trickle down to the guys risking their lives in the cockpit. The NHRA was making a fortune, but the actual racers? They were mostly running on pocket change and sheer willpower. Now you might be thinking, come on, these were the superstars of the golden age. They must have been pulling in serious cash, right? Well, not exactly. Let's look at some eye-opening statistics from credible historical archives, including records preserved by drag racing historians. Even a legendary icon like Don Big Daddy Garlits only took home about $7,400 for winning the entire top fuel category at Indy back in 1967. Think about that. The absolute biggest race of the entire year, and the winner's check was barely enough to buy a modest passenger car back then. Historians estimate that before 1971, almost nobody was taking home more than $3,000 to $4,000 for a major national event win. When you subtract the astronomical costs of nitro fuel, replacement engine blocks, melted pistons, and travel expenses across the United States, most teams were actually losing money just by showing up. But it gets even worse. The real bone of contention was not just the prize money. It was what the industry called appearance money. This was guaranteed cash handed out to a select group of superstar drivers just for rolling their trailers into the gate. It did not matter if they blew up their engines in the first round of qualifying. They got paid simply because their names on the flyer sold tickets. The NHRA used this system to keep guys like Don Prudhomme and Don Garlits on the entry list. But if you were not on that highly exclusive, hand-picked short list, you got absolutely nothing. You had to risk your life, pass by pass, round by round, with zero financial guarantees. To put this in perspective, think of it like this. Imagine you are a world-class chef invited to cook at a massive food festival. The organizers pay the celebrity television chefs thousands of dollars just to walk through the door, but they tell you that you only get paid if you win the best dish competition at the very end of the weekend. If your oven breaks or an ingredient goes bad, you go home completely broke, even though your presence helped draw the crowd in the first place. It was a brutal, deeply unfair system, and it created an intense undercurrent of anger in the pits. This is where it gets really interesting. Tim Beebe and John Mulligan had built what was arguably the most formidable, consistently fast top fuel operation in the entire country, but they were completely shut out of that appearance money gravy train. They were the ultimate working-class heroes of the drag strip. Beebe was the brilliant, quiet tuner running the operation out of Garden Grove, California. Mulligan was his driver, a charismatic, incredibly popular young guy from Orange County who had earned the ultimate respect of his peers. Their car was an absolute work of art. Painted a brilliant, deep green with a lucky shamrock on the side, it proudly carried the name the Fighting Irish. Underneath that beautiful green paint was a chassis that had lived several lives. It started out as a handcrafted, front-engine frame built by Frank Husser at Racecar Specialties. Later, they upgraded to a state-of-the-art chassis built by Woody Gilmore at Racecar Engineering, which was basically the absolute gold standard of chassis builders at the time. By 1968, the Fighting Irish Dragster was constantly running at the very front of the pack. They were so incredibly fast that they reached the final round of 2 massive national events that year. They finished runner-up to Don Garlits at the Spring Nationals, and then runner-up to Benny Osborne in Tulsa. In fact, they recorded the absolute fastest speed of the entire event before an unexpected clutch issue cost them that big legendary event win. Let us talk about how John Mulligan actually broke into the unforgiving world of drag racing. You see, he did not just step into a championship-level top-fuel cockpit overnight with an easy ride or wealthy corporate backing. He started at the absolute grassroots level, slinging a rugged Willis coupe in the rowdy, wheel-standing gasser ranks during the early 60s. That was where the real drivers cut their teeth. If you could handle an unpredictable, high-riding gasser trying to steer violently toward the guardrails at over 100 miles per hour, you could handle pretty much anything on 4 wheels. By 1964, his natural driving instincts earned him a seat with Ward and Ware, steering front-engine slingshot dragsters nicknamed Longshot and Big Shot. But the massive breakthrough occurred when he joined forces with master engine tuner Gene Adams. Together, in 1966 at Carlsbad Raceway in Southern California, they accomplished a milestone that drag racing historians still talk about with absolute reverence. John Mulligan became the first driver in motorsport history to break cleanly into the legendary 6-second zone, clocking an astonishing 6.95-second run. He did not merely edge past the record. He obliterated the existing track benchmark by nearly 2 full tenths of a second. In a sport where elapsed times were measured and fought over in tiny fractions of a second, leaping forward by 2 tenths was like breaking the sound barrier. By the conclusion of that 1966 season, this young California driver had posted 6 of the 20 quickest times recorded across the entire United States. He was operating on a completely different level than almost everyone else in the pit. Now you might be thinking, well, if he was that blindingly fast, every car owner in America must have been throwing contracts at his feet. But drag racing back then was a brutal and tightly wound fraternity. Around that time, Mulligan suffered a severely broken jaw in an unexpected road accident away from the track. He was sidelined for months, watching his close friend and rival Steve Carbone fill in behind the wheel of Adams' dragster. That detail tells you everything about the sport during that era. It was an incredibly tight community. These competitors would battle fiercely on the track at over 200 miles per hour, and then spend all night sharing spare parts, welding equipment, and advice under bare garage light bulbs. When Mulligan was fully recovered and seeking a permanent seat around 1967, fate intervened. Tim Beebe had built an exceptionally potent top-fuel operation, and his brother Dave had been handling driving duties. But Dave was what seasoned drag racers referred to as a classic homer. He had a steady, reliable career as the service manager at a Chevrolet dealership in Fullerton, and he had a loving family he wanted to be home with every single night. The relentless grind of towing a race car across thousands of highway miles across America was simply not the life he wanted to pursue. So Dave stepped out of the roll cage. This is where it gets really interesting. Up until that point, John Mulligan had been the Beebe brothers' most intense and formidable on-track rival. Rather than remaining bitter adversaries, Tim Beebe recognized Mulligan's once-in-a-generation talent, picked up the phone, and invited him to take over the seat. It was an extraordinary pairing that would completely alter the trajectory of Top Fuel history. Look, before we get into the wild mechanical escalation of 1969, we have to talk about the man himself, because understanding his character explains why people still worship his memory over 5 decades later. His close friends called him Mo, but throughout the racing pits, he went by an iconic nickname, the Zookeeper. Here is the thing, that nickname was born out of legendary fearlessness. Close friend named Gene Townley shared a wild story about a late night in Garden Grove behind a local shop known simply as The Cave. The crew was completely broke, hanging around with empty pockets, when someone spotted an empty police cruiser parked nearby with an active K-9 police dog sitting in the back. A crazy dare was made, and Mulligan looked right at Townley without blinking and dared him to climb into the vehicle with the dog. Townley actually climbed into the back seat, and when the startled police officer rushed outside with his sidearm drawn, Mulligan stayed completely calm. He smoothly walked up, smiled, and asked the officer if he was really planning to shoot Big Gene. That fearless, unshakable composure defined his personality on and off the quarter mile. Historians who interviewed Tim Beebe noted that nobody in the sport ever had a negative word to say about Mulligan. In a cutthroat sport filled with giant egos and fiery tempers, Mulligan was beloved by crew members, rivals, and fans alike. He embodied the golden spirit of what the NHRA fondly remembers as its Camelot era, an unforgettable time when the sport felt less like a cutthroat corporate circus and more like an adventurous band of brothers. Here is what most people do not realize. Even while holding dozens of track records, the Fighting Irish team was constantly fighting financial starvation. They were living the classic broke and hungry racer life, sometimes pooling loose change between friends just to buy food and spark plugs. Yet as the 1969 season began, their grit paid off. In February 1969, they entered the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona. In the semi-finals, Mulligan ran a sensational 6.93-second pass to edge out Leroy Goldstein, who posted the exact same number. That set up a massive final clash against Don Prudhomme. In that legendary showdown, Prudhomme suffered a mechanical failure, and Mulligan roared across the stripe at 6.95 seconds, claiming victory. It was a massive win, but that victory purse did not fix the deeply unfair appearance money system at all. Let us look at what happened immediately after that massive Pomona win, because that is where the real pressure started mounting. Winning the NHRA Winter Nationals in early 1969 gave the Fighting Irish team a temporary boost of credibility, but it did not solve the fundamental financial disparity haunting the pit area. That $6,900 purse vanished almost instantly into fresh spare parts, racing fuel, travel costs, and shop overhead. Meanwhile, the superstars of the sport were still getting paid thousands of dollars simply for rolling their trailers through the pit gates before turning a single wrench. The Beebe and Mulligan crew were working twice as hard for half the security. Then, in June at the Spring Nationals, reality dealt them a brutal wake-up call. They got eliminated in the very first round of eliminations by Tom Hoover. In the high-stakes world of front-engine top-fuel dragsters, you were always just one bad spark plug, one blown head gasket, or one fraction of a second away from packing up your trailer and heading home with empty pockets. That bitter defeat lit an absolute fire under Tim Beebe. He knew that to beat the corporate-backed titans and force the drag racing establishment to respect them, they needed an overwhelming mechanical advantage. They needed horsepower that nobody else in the sport could even comprehend. This is where it gets really interesting, because the team made a monumental mechanical shift that completely altered their destiny. Heading toward the summer stretch, Tim Beebe partnered with Marv Rifchin, the legendary founder of M&H Tires, to broker a game-changing deal. They secured a monstrous 426 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi engine straight from the skunkworks of the iconic Ramchargers group. Now, you might be thinking, wait, were not most top-tier dragsters running earlier 392 Hemi motors back then? Well, that is a common debate among vintage drag racing historians, because a few contemporary magazine articles mistakenly listed a 392. But the most authentic historical records confirm it was that potent 426 Ramchargers power plant that changed everything. The results were instantaneous and frankly terrifying. When Beebe dropped that fresh power plant into the Gilmore chassis and applied his aggressive nitro tuning witchcraft, the Fighting Irish Dragster did not just match the competition. It started running faster and quicker than the factory-backed Ramchargers team itself. Almost overnight, their terminal trap speeds skyrocketed to an astonishing 233 miles per hour. Look, in 1969, 233 miles per hour in a front-engine dragster, sitting inches behind a blown Hemi with your legs straddling the rear differential, was like riding a guided missile down a narrow asphalt alleyway. Here is what most people do not realize about racing physics during this vintage era. Raw horsepower always comes with a hidden, terrifying cost that has nothing to do with dollars and cents. To understand this, think of an intense analogy. Imagine taking a lightweight canvas biplane from the early days of aviation and bolting a modern supersonic jet engine onto the wings without reinforcing the wooden frame or the structural steel cables. The airplane will fly unimaginably fast for a brief moment, but every single rivet, strut, and control wire is vibrating under loads it was never designed to survive. That was the exact mechanical reality inside the Fighting Irish Dragster. The Woody Gilmore chassis and standard drivetrain components had been engineered to handle the speeds and torque loads of 1968. By forcing that chassis to absorb the violent, earth-shaking horsepower of a 233-mile-per-hour pass in late 1969, they were pushing every single bolt, weld, and bearing into an untested danger zone. Every extra mile per hour generated exponential stress throughout the entire driveline, waiting for the weakest link to fail. And that brings us to late August 1969, as the entire drag racing world descended upon Indianapolis Raceway Park for the prestigious US Nationals. This was the undisputed Super Bowl of motorsport, packed with record crowds, aggressive media coverage, and the high-powered cameras of ABC's Wide World of Sports. Yet, when Tim Beebe and John Mulligan arrived at the front gate, they discovered that the NHRA was sticking to its old, infuriating appearance-money hierarchy. Once again, guys like Don Garlits and Don Prudhomme were handed guaranteed appearance checks just to put their cars on display, while Beebe and Mulligan, who possessed the quickest car in America, were offered nothing. That was the absolute breaking point. Tim Beebe decided he was done playing the political game quietly. In an act of pure, unfiltered defiance, Beebe took a set of wrenches and systematically unbolted the sleek front nose cone and every single aluminum body panel from the car. He left the gorgeous emerald green paintwork sitting in the trailer and pushed a completely bare, skeletal steel frame out into the staging lanes for all the corporate executives, competitors, and cameras to see. If the NHRA refused to pay the Fighting Irish team for their presence, Beebe was not going to give them a pretty showpiece for their promotional brochures. People walking past in the staging lanes were totally confused, assuming the team had suffered a catastrophic failure or gone completely broke. But on Friday afternoon, John Mulligan strapped into that bare skeleton, fired up the Ramchargers Hemi, and rolled to the starting line for qualifying. When the green light flashed, Mulligan unleashed an earth-shattering pass that stopped the clocks at an unbelievable 6.43 seconds. To put that in perspective, the existing national record held by Jerry Ruth was 6.68. Mulligan did not just break the record. He annihilated it by a quarter of a full second in a single pass. The entire drag strip erupted in total disbelief. But during that historic 6.43 blast, something subtle happened. The chassis shuddered with an unfamiliar tire shake at the top end. Beebe had been slipping the clutch harder to extract maximum speed, pushing the driveline right to the edge of mechanical destruction. Look, by the time the sun came up over Indianapolis on Labor Day, September 1, 1969, the atmosphere around Indianapolis Raceway Park was electric. This was not just another summer weekend at a local drag strip. This was the single most prestigious gathering of speed on Earth. The grandstands were overflowing with tens of thousands of diehard gearheads, and the pit lanes were completely jammed with wall-to-wall spectators, mechanics, and journalists. What made this day truly unique was the heavy presence of television production crews from ABC's wide world of sport. Back then, national television coverage of drag racing was practically unheard of. Wally Parks, the visionary founder of the NHRA, had spent years fiercely protecting the public image of the sport, deliberately keeping catastrophic crash footage away from mainstream news broadcasts because he was terrified that the general public would label drag racing as an uncivilized blood sport. So having network television cameras lining the guardrails was undeniable proof that top fuel racing had officially arrived on the national stage. But nobody standing in that sweltering Indiana heat had any idea that those broadcast lenses were about to capture one of the most haunting moments in motorsport history. In the opening round of Top Fuel eliminations, the pairing sheet produced a match that felt like a movie script. In one lane was TV Tommy Evo, a veteran racer who had been touring the country since the 1950s and knew every trick in the book. In the other lane sat John Mulligan in the unpainted, stripped-down Fighting Irish slingshot. The contrast between these two machines could not have been starker. Evo's car was polished, professional, and gleaming under the morning sun, representing the established showmanship of the sport. Mulligan's Dragster, stripped of its emerald bodywork in silent protest against the purse structure, looked like an angry, unrefined mechanical predator. The staging lanes went dead silent as both drivers initiated their smoky burnouts, laying down thick ribbons of hot rubber along the racing groove. When they pre-staged and crept forward into the beams, the deafening roar of two supercharged Chrysler engines running on 85% nitromethane shook the concrete grandstands right down to their deep structural foundations on race day morning. Now, you might be thinking, what could possibly go wrong with a car that had just effortlessly obliterated the national record by a quarter of a second? This is where it gets really interesting, because the absolute smallest engineering decision can produce catastrophic consequences when you are playing with thousands of horsepower. Here's the thing, on a front-engine slingshot dragster, the driver literally sits directly over the rear differential, straddling the torque tube inches away from the spinning flywheel and clutch housing. Most competitive top fuel teams of that era utilized a flexible driveline connection commonly referred to in the pits as a Greek coupler. This specialized coupling was specifically engineered with internal rubber bushings designed to absorb the violent, high-frequency vibrations generated by massive tire shake. But the Fighting Irish car was not running a Greek coupler. Instead, Tim Beebe had installed a conventional universal joint with the needle bearings removed, bolting the assembly rigidly to the rear-end pumpkin using 4 small, quarter-inch grade 8 steel bolts without any give whatsoever. Think of it like this. Imagine taking a heavy steel sledgehammer and pounding it directly against a crystal glass at 3,000 beats per minute. That was the exact physical punishment those 4 quarter-inch bolts were being asked to endure. When a top-fuel dragster experiences severe tire shake, the massive Goodyear rear tires oscillate violently, sending shock waves through the chassis and driveline that can easily snap hardened steel like dry kindling. Beebe's tune-up was slipping the clutch with unprecedented aggression to prevent initial tire spin off the line, but once the car grabbed maximum traction down track, all that stored energy reverberated backward into the rigid driveline. To make matters worse, wild rumors circulated for decades that the team was secretly mixing hydrazine into their fuel tank. Hydrazine was a notoriously unstable rocket fuel additive that a few reckless racers experimented with in that era to generate impossible horsepower numbers. But Tim Beebe later debunked that myth completely. The engine never contained exotic rocket propellant. The failure was purely structural and utterly mechanical. When the green tree dropped, Mulligan reacted with lightning precision. The Fighting Irish Dragster leaped off the starting line with fierce power, pulling several car lengths ahead of Tommy Evo instantly. As the car tore past the tree and screamed down the track, it looked like Mulligan was well on his way to resetting the national record once again. But as the machine crossed the 800-foot mark and approached the 1,000-foot cones at over 200 miles per hour, that deadly vibration returned with extreme fury. Under the unimaginable torsional load, the 4/4-inch driveline bolts sheared off. With the rear connection severed, the high-speed drive shaft whipped violently out of alignment, instantly exploding the multi-disc clutch assembly inside the bell housing. High-velocity shrapnel tore straight through the engine's cast aluminum oil pan, slicing a gaping hole. Pressurized, boiling motor oil instantly sprayed directly onto the red-hot exhaust Zoomy headers, igniting a massive, rolling fireball that swallowed the entire cockpit in a fraction of a second. Here is what most people don't realize. Even while completely engulfed in a raging inferno and enduring unfathomable temperatures, John Mulligan's final human instinct was pure, selfless heroism. Instead of letting the flaming car drift wildly into Tommy Evo's adjacent lane or toward the exposed spectator fence, Mulligan fought through the blinding fire and consciously guided the dragster toward the outer steel guardrail. The burning wreck rocketed across the finish line ahead of Evo, stopping the clocks at a surreal pace before grinding to a halt in the shutdown area. Safety crews rushed through the smoke to pull the brave driver from the melted cockpit. The silence that fell over Indianapolis Raceway Park after the smoke cleared was unlike anything the sport had ever experienced. In the immediate chaos following the crash, track workers, safety crews, and fellow racers ran toward the burning wreckage at the end of the shutdown area. Mulligan was extracted from the twisted roll cage, conscious and fighting. A freelance photographer standing roughly 300 feet down track had tracked the entire run through his camera lens. He managed to capture 3 vivid slide frames of the fireball crossing the finish line. Weeks later, when the tragic final news arrived, that photographer quietly removed those 3 developed slides from his personal archive and locked them away in a drawer, never to look at them again. That was how deeply this horrific moment affected everyone who stood witness on that fateful September afternoon. Mulligan was rushed by ambulance to Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, suffering from severe second- and third-degree burns across a major percentage of his body. Now, you might be thinking, if someone survives a 200-mile-per-hour fiery crash and arrives at the emergency room talking, they must be on the road to recovery, right? But here's the thing, vintage burn trauma medicine in the late 1960s was vastly different from modern medical capabilities. When severe fire envelopes a driver trapped in an open cockpit, the most lethal injury often occurs within the respiratory tract due to inhaling superheated fumes, toxic nitro combustion byproducts, and vaporized oil. Yet, during those first few critical days in the intensive care unit, John Mulligan showed the unbelievable toughness that had earned him the Zookeeper moniker. He sat upright in his hospital bed, recognized his close friends who flew in from California, and even cracked jokes with the nursing staff. For a brief, hopeful window, the entire drag racing world genuinely believed that their beloved superstar was going to beat the impossible odds and walk out of that hospital room. Look, the support pouring into Indianapolis was extraordinary. Telegrams, get-well cards, and donations flooded the hospital front desk from thousands of grassroots fans across the country. Tim Beebe, carrying an unimaginable emotional burden, stayed close as his driver fought the toughest battle of his life. But as the days dragged on, the brutal biological reality of severe burn complications took over. The human skin serves as the body's ultimate protective shield, and when large portions of that barrier are destroyed, preventing systemic bacterial infection becomes an uphill battle. By the second week of September, secondary infections and intense respiratory stress began overwhelming his system. His internal organs, strained to absolute exhaustion, started to falter under the immense trauma. On September 17, 1969, 16 long, agonizing days after the crash at the US Nationals, John "Mo" Mulligan took his final breath. He was just 26 years old. The news sent an immediate shockwave throughout the United States motorsport landscape. Drag racing had lost drivers before, but the loss of Mulligan felt deeply personal to everyone from the Southern California beach towns to the Midwest track. He was not just another fast driver on the entry list. He was universally respected, endlessly humble, and widely considered the most naturally gifted wheelman of his entire generation. At his memorial service, where friends, family, and fierce rivals gathered in profound grief, the eulogy cited his astonishing achievement of holding as many as 38 national track records throughout his short career. Whether that exact number was an official sanctioning body tally or a heartfelt tribute from those who watched him dominate drag strips across America, the underlying message was unmistakable. John Mulligan was an irreplaceable titan of the sport. This is where it gets really interesting, because Mulligan's tragic passing was not an isolated wake-up call. It was the beginning of an inevitable technological revolution that would permanently reshape drag racing forever. Here's what most people don't realize. Sitting directly behind a blown nitromethane engine with a spinning clutch inches from your chest and a rigid differential between your legs was a fundamentally flawed, lethal design. Racers called them slingshots because the cockpit was slung out behind the rear axle, but in reality, drivers were sitting directly in the kill zone whenever mechanical parts violently disintegrated. Just 6 months after Mulligan's death, in March 1970 at Lyons Drag Strip, Don Garlits suffered a catastrophic transmission explosion in his front-engine dragster that severed his right foot in half. That terrifying string of disasters forced the entire motorsport industry to look in the mirror. Garlits famously sat in his hospital bed in Long Beach and resolved that he would never pilot a front-engine top-fuel car again. He returned to his Florida shop and perfected the modern rear-engine dragster design, moving the cockpit entirely forward of the engine block and enclosing the driver safely ahead of any potential driveline or clutch explosions. The rear-engine revolution, which is now the universal standard seen in every professional top-fuel dragster across the globe today, was paid for in blood by pioneers who pushed the front-engine chassis far beyond its mechanical limit. John Mulligan and Tim Beebe had extracted unprecedented speed from that Woody Gilmore chassis, hitting velocities that physics could no longer contain within that vintage design layout. To put the sheer magnitude of their performance into context, think of an intense historical analogy. In the earliest days of locomotive travel, engineers kept adding bigger steam boilers to wooden passenger frames until the physical structures began tearing apart under the violent centrifugal forces of speed. Beebe and Mulligan did not fail because of lack of skill. They were daring pioneers pushing the extreme frontier of horsepower before safety engineering had caught up with mechanical capability. Their stripped-down, naked dragster at Indianapolis had shattered barriers and proven what raw talent could achieve when fueled by pride, defiance, and mechanical genius. Look, the story of the Fighting Irish does not end in senseless tragedy. It stands as a timeless monument to human defiance, unbreakable brotherhood, and the relentless pursuit of speed. In the immediate aftermath of 1969, the landscape of professional drag racing began an irreversible shift. Drivers across the nation realized that risking everything for mere pennies while sanctioning bodies banked massive profits was no longer sustainable. That simmering frustration over unfair appearance money and hazardous racer safety, which Tim Beebe had so boldly protested by unbolting the body panels, finally exploded into open rebellion just a few years later. In 1972, Don Garlits and a united coalition of grassroots racers formed the Professional Racers Association and launched their own independent national championship event, demanding equitable payouts, transparent prize money, and significantly upgraded safety measures for every competitor on the property. Now, you might be thinking, Did Tim Beebe ever find the strength to return to the sport after losing his closest brother in arms? Here's the thing, true racers have nitromethane running through their veins, and walking away from the quarter mile was something Beebe could not do. He continued building and tuning some of the most fearsome dragsters on Earth, teaming up with top-tier drivers like Dave Settles and eventually capturing the prestigious 1973 NHRA Top Fuel World Championship. Yet, to the end of his life, Beebe always spoke of John Mulligan with profound reverence and emotional depth. In interviews decades later, whenever historians asked him about that legendary Labor Day weekend at Indianapolis, Beebe's voice would soften as he remembered the lightning-fast kid from Orange County who feared nothing, mastered every car he touched, and brought genuine warmth to everyone in the pits. This is where it gets really interesting for anyone who truly loves motorsport history. John Mulligan's 6.43-second qualifying run in that bare, unpainted slingshot remains one of the single greatest moments of pure athletic brilliance in American racing lore. Think about it. He took a stripped-down, bare-bones hot rod and went faster than any human being in history had ever traveled down a drag strip. It was not giant corporate sponsors, glossy custom paint, or mainstream television hype that made that run immortal. It was the raw, unfiltered combination of an extraordinary driver and a master tuner operating in absolute harmony on the outer limits of physical capability. Here's what most people don't realize when they watch modern top-fuel dragsters blast down the track at over 330 miles per hour today. Every single carbon fiber safety cell, every fire suppression nozzle, every rear engine configuration, and every fair payout structure exists because of the fearless pioneers of 1969. Men like John Mo Mulligan paid the ultimate price, so that future generations of racers could chase the absolute frontier of horsepower and walk away safely. The stripped green skeleton of the Fighting Irish dragster will forever stand as the ultimate symbol of courage, integrity, and timeless racing glory. When you reflect back on the story of the Fighting Irish, it serves as a powerful reminder of an era when racing was dictated purely by grit, ingenuity, and unyielding personal conviction. In today's corporate automotive landscape, where algorithms, multi-million-dollar wind tunnels, and massive corporate marketing departments dictate motorsport decisions, there is something deeply sacred about two guys in a modest California shop deciding to challenge the entire racing establishment with nothing more than raw steel and sheer courage. They did not bow to political pressure or settle for second-class treatment. They let their performance on the asphalt do all the talking. That spirit of authentic rebellion is why the name John Mulligan still sends chills down the spines of drag racing enthusiasts across the globe. His legacy is etched permanently into the quarter-mile record books, reminding us all that true legends are never defined by how much money they were handed, but by how fiercely they fought when everything was on the line.